Disclaimer. No data subjects were harmed in the making of this podcast.
Welcome to the Privacy Bar and Bants podcast. We make privacy awareness simple. Sit back, relax, and grab your darkest privacy myths and misconceptions. Your mind-boggling experience begins in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Oh, we need to drink water.
So, anyway, so who am I? I'm Yetunde Industry.
Next question. Next. Hello, everybody. Hello, world. Welcome to another episode of the Privacy Bar and Bands podcast. And we're here again, recording again. We hope that you have missed us the way that we have missed you. But welcome to the podcast again today, and it's another exciting episode. We have someone who we have been looking forward to having on the podcast for a very long time. I'm sure Dr shares my sense. I think in the original list of episodes that we actually had planned for the podcast, we had an episode that was actually specifically for her. But I don't know why. Do you know what the funny thing is? Because we're always trying to do things like in order. So we didn't like reach out to everyone at once. We were kind of going like one by one, and like so then we finally made it. And then when we reached out, we for a while there was no communication between both sides and everything. And then eventually we got there, and then now we're here basically, and it's really nice to have Patricia here with us. Just a little bit of an introduction. Just before we go in and we let her speak for herself. Patricia is a data protection. We have with us on the podcast, first of all, Patricia Boshe, Dr. Patricia Boshe. Patricia, I'm not sure if I said that right, but please forgive me. I should have actually clarified how to say your name properly before we
No, it's quite correct.
Yay. Oh, thank you. Dr. Patricia is a data protection consultant and researcher and trainer at the University of Passau. She holds a PhD in law, so she's like us. Also, she has the law aspect to her, but she's also like a data protection person. I think that Olakwa and I can both say that we can relate. And she did her thesis on data protection legal reforms in Africa, and she has an LLM in IT and telecommunications law. She's also the co-founder and co-director of the African Law and Technology Institute, a research institute that's focusing on the interaction between law, technology, and society from an interdisciplinary perspective. So we have the great honor of having on the podcast today, Dr. Patricia. Welcome. How are you feeling to be here finally?
I'm actually very excited because I remember the first time you reached out, and it took me some time to respond because I was not. You reached me out through LinkedIn, and at that moment I was very hooked up with something else, and I wasn't at LinkedIn for about, I think, 2 weeks or something. And then I came and found, I saw your message. I was like, oh my, I hope this girl doesn't feel like I'm undermining her efforts. So I responded, and you responded, and we planned, and at some point we kept on replanning. But finally, I'm happy to be here. I'm really happy to be here.
We're happy to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have so many, we have little podcasts. So it's actually quite exciting. I think every time that we have a new guest on the podcast, I don't know about you, Dolakwa, as well, but I always look forward to is the fact that we're going to hear a different voice on the other end of the podcast, and the fact that we're going to hear there's always something new that everybody brings onto the podcast, and there's always one way that we learn. So I'm actually looking forward to today's episode, which we're keeping a secret for like the next few minutes, is actually one that I think it required us to even have a pre-recording meeting before we did this episode because it's that interesting. But before we get into all that fun stuff, I just wanted to ask Dr. Patricia, how's your week been? How is your work in privacy going? What's going on in the privacy world on your end?
Hey, my week is always full of things, full of stuff, and actually, it's a lot that is going on in the privacy sphere, and I'm sure you know that every day you wake up in the morning, you click on social media, and you find something new. If it's not a law, it's a regulation. If not regulation, then AI has come up with something. So it's always exciting. There's always something new to experience, to learn, to share. So my week has been that interesting. And I'm still learning a few things, not a few things, quite a lot of things I'm still learning, because every day is a classroom for me. I open my computer, I open my a browser, and something pops up. I'm like, oh my, I had no idea about this. And it's something that I should have known. So my week has been a learning week, very active and very exciting week, at the same time, very exhausting. But I'm happy. I'm happy how the week went, and I'm looking forward for the next.
And literally, I think every privacy person would say that
Yeah,
their
and
week
I
is
mean, I
always full of
totally agree
learning
that
new
there's
stuff.
always something,
Yeah.
a topical new issue or a new regulation or a new countries, if they're reviewing their law, or there's a new bill, there's just always something, or litigation case, there's always something in the privacy world.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
and that
absolutely.
makes it very interesting,
Yeah,
area of professional. Yeah, I mean, it's somewhere that where you don't get bored. You can only get exhausted, but you don't get bored.
true.
I think it's even an over of information. Like there's always something coming at you. More
Yeah,
the absence of stuff. There's always
yes.
something new. I think. I think it's
Mhm.
probably okay. We're bringing it into our podcast traditions now. We want to do a little bit of. We don't know. I don't know how much of my email you actually read. I'm gonna hand over to Dalakwa to deal on this one because I feel like I'm the one that gets the flag for this all the time.
Okay,
So
so
Dalakwa,
I
over
mean,
to
it's
this
just
one.
it's really simple, right? On this part of the episode, you just get to share like a privacy fail, right? Typically, a privacy fail story is either a personal experience or something you've read. I mean, anything you've seen or any story you've seen or experienced that you just felt like, no, they didn't do privacy right, or I mean, they misinterpreted a privacy best practices, something really related to that, right? So, I mean, we're inviting you to share one with us.
Well, I would rather share an
Okay.
experience where I was invited um, at the office. I was invited by a friend in an office, and this person actually is venturing into privacy and data protection sort of training and stuff. So when I entered the office, the first place usually you see is a reception or a place where you introduce yourself and tell why you're there. And I entered there, and the first thing I see is a table without things to cover. I don't know what you call them. Um, and there's a lady there sitting, and she asked me, "How am I, and who I'm there to see?" And I say, "I'm here to see so and so." And then she directs me to the office. I see the person who invited me, and the first thing I told him is that, if I was a data protection and privacy auditor, you would have failed completely, because I entered the door, the place where everybody is there, the face of your office is quite transparent, beyond transparent. I can see papers on the table. It's a legal office. I can see
Hmm.
planes. I can see, you know, and you say you want to explore this area, privacy and data protection. I mean, your front desk. I mean, the opposite of privacy and
Actually,
data
the
protection.
opposite.
Because if I wanted, I could even take some photos with my phone. Yeah. And he was like, okay, I get it. I'll contact you to help us, reset the office and everything. But those are simple things which people overlook when they set up. Maybe it's an office or a place of work, are things that people overlook in terms of privacy and data protection. Practical things that people don't really think about. We think of protecting personal information in
Yeah.
computers, social media, but we do not think in our daily life, in our professional life, how does my office looks like? How are the documents, my customer
Mhm.
or client documents, being
Exactly.
kept? Those are small things that we quite overlook, but are very critical in protecting privacy and personal
I,
information.
I, I mean, Thank you, Patricia. I totally agree.
Absolutely.
I especially in Nigeria, it's actually a thing in Nigeria where you go to an office and they give you this book at the front desk or reception, and you have to fill in your name, your address, your phone number, and while you're there, sometimes even the details of your personal computer or any device you're going in with, and I find it really weird. So what I usually do is I try as much as to not give out anything. I literally will put the country. I'm not going to give you my address. I'll put the country. I'll put my initials. I mean, any way to avoid it. But I mean, this is one really amazing point you've raised.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, I think what struck out with me is the fact that it's always, why is it always law offices that
Yeah,
do the
true.
most rude? Because I think they always think of personal data only in terms of, even when they do think about it, they think about it mostly in terms of their clients. And that kind of tie between, they don't think of data protection on its own, they mostly think of it in the
True.
context of their confidentiality obligations, which is a problem, because there's the personal data of your employees, the personal data of guests, there's personal data of every single person that you actively partake in, or even passively partake in taking their data,
Yeah.
that you have to be conscious about. So I think, yeah, it's actually quite an interesting point you've raised.
Yeah.
Okay, second little bonus round, just kind of break the ice and get the conversation flowing in anticipation for the big reveal that we have coming up. So I'd like to ask you to kindly spotlight a privacy framework of a country or an organization in Africa that you believe everyone should know about, or is representative of a big move towards like a much more consistent or efficient system of data protection across Africa. Because I think the reason why we're more specific on Africa as well is because we're a podcast that's focused on that, and also the fact that Africa is one of the areas of the world that's currently still struggling a bit to get onto. Although we're making moves, I just think it's important to kind of spotlight our wins as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I will go with I think I'll go with South Africa. The POPIA, yeah, the Protection
yeah.
of Personal Information Act. I think I like that law. This is my personal preference. I like that law because when you look at how, for example, okay, we have those data protection principles, which are almost the same across those countries that have data protection. But then the main controversy in most of data protection laws, not only in Africa but across, is the setting up of the data protection regulator, who is supposed to be very independent in the discharge of their activities. When you look at South African law, and believe me, I've looked into so many African law, almost all the 34 laws that are there. The South African laws establishes this information regulator in a way that, in the paper at least, shows that this person who is going to be appointed as information regulator is going to have the freedom to oversee the implementation of the law. He's not appointed by an executive per se, like a president or prime minister or the minister of communication. He's being voted by the parliament. His name is being nominated, and then after nominated, being brought to before the parliament, and he's been nominated by the parliament. So it's not a single person that appoints the information regulator, and so he's not answerable, or he's not loyal to one person or a certain ministry. And the second thing is also the removal of the information regulator, the commissioner, is a process that involves not a single person, but a body, the parliament. Other than that, the payment, the salary, all the benefits are being sort of regulated by a labor act, if I'm not mistaken, and not by a certain regulation that will be or is expected to be issued by the minister. So you can see the system itself allows this person to function or independently, without being fearfully or without favoring a certain person, because no one, as a single person, no one is able to say, I put you there. and so you have to be loyal to me. That is one. Two, what I like about Popia is also the fact that the law is very detailed in terms of remuneration, what laws to apply when you have to sort of determine the benefits of the information regulator and its staff. It's also very detailed on the appointment procedure, dismissal procedure. It's very detailed about, let's say, who has to be there in terms of qualifications. What kind of qualification is the chairperson for information regulator has to have to be able to be appointed. So it's, for me, in terms of the laws in African countries, that my preference or is the South African law, that I'm happy with it. The only thing that is I'm still very curious about Popia is that it's the only law in Africa, I think, until this time, that not only protect natural persons or not only designate natural persons as data subjects, but as well as juristic persons. So a company in South Africa is also protected by Popia, not only a natural person. That's very curious for me, and I don't know why, what the reason they decided to have juristic persons as data subjects, but I still have to figure that out.
This is a very interesting one that you've touched on, the idea of juristic persons being regarded as data subjects. Thinking about the way that privacy laws themselves originated from the right to privacy, which is directly focused or focused towards, I guess, more human as opposed to natural persons as opposed to juristic persons. What are some of the challenges that you envision this sort of position, like bringing up in future? Or resulting in future, because when you have a juristic person having data protection rights that are, well, on the face of it, or originally predicted to be for natural persons, there are bound to be some tensions there.
I believe one of the things that came across my mind the first time I saw this provision is that, so how do you draw a balance between companies' data and personal data of its, for example, its employees or directors? What I see or envision in terms of controversy is when a certain personal information is considered company's data, and then an employee or director of that company comes up and say, no, this is my data because I produced this data. So I think that is something that may come up later on. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see, because as a company as a company, I'm trying to imagine a situation where a company has its own data. I mean, produce its own data, which no individual can claim that that is my making.
That's actually quite interesting, because the tensions, I guess this is sort of the tensions between sort of that creative intellectual ownership of data and the right to actually protect data as per personal data. So where does the data, where does the right of the object of that data begin, as opposed to the right of the person who created the data sets, which I think is even a general I think issue when you start thinking about databases as well, and privacy rights. I mean, it's been resolved obviously as a clear issue, but I think it's one of those things that is one of the tensions that we saw in that
I
area as
mean,
well.
I think I particularly also just like the fact that Patricia mentioned the Popia, right? Because I mean, I've always felt like they are one of like the most active regulators in Africa. They're always, I mean, there's always like a new guideline that is informative, or a new advisory, or just a new regulation on their part. And I mean, they're just really hands on when it comes to um new occurrences in the data protection space, right? So I think their work is quite commendable. I mean,
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
a good spotlight there.
They're very. Yeah, I think they're very active, because and their regulator Pansy Tlakula, advocate. I think she's very hands on. She's very she understands the tasks
Yeah.
of a regulator. And when you speak or when you hear her speaking, you can see that she understands what she's supposed to do as a regulator, and you can see she's able to draw lines between acting as a regulator and acting as an advisor in the implementation of data protection to controllers. Uh, Something that the first time I heard her speaking about really struck me. I never thought of it. But also, I think there are other countries in Africa that are very active in this area. I mean, enforcing data protection law, coming up with um, sort of policies. There is Kenya, there is Nigeria, for example, and actually Kenya has come up with something that is a bit unique. I think last year, if I'm not mistaken, the commissioner published a framework of what do you call it, alternative dispute resolution for data protection,
Yeah.
something that is not
I think I saw that.
very very common in this area. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think
It's very commendable. Funny.
South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, they are in the forefront.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting because there was also something you mentioned earlier as well. You said about the independence of the supervisory authority. I feel like it would be unfair not to mention the fact that we have seen in the past couple of weeks the UK announced plans to sort of revisit the UK GDPR and Data Protection Act to sort of recreate the office of what we know now as the Information Commissioner's Office
Mhm.
to then be, I think, the Information Commission, which would then be under the supervision of the Secretary of State, which is a very different system to what was initially predicted when the office for the regulator was called to be independent.
Mhm.
So I just thought I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Are you familiar with what's going on in that area, and what do you feel about that?
Well, there are reasons that why they decided to do that, and this is something that we can see. For example, when you speak of African countries, you will see most commissioners are not sort of created or established as self-standing bodies or agencies. They are either under the ministry or they are under president's office. And even when they are just an office like the Kenyan Data Protection Commission, which is a separate office, it's also receives some benefits or budget or financial benefits from a ministry. Or you can find a situation where, for example, in Nigeria, for example, they do not have they still have the regulation, not a comprehensive data protection, which they are working on at the moment. But the same case in Uganda, you find that the commissioners are being set up under the ICT commissions or ICT regulators. So, not to say
Or
that
cybersecurity?
yeah, this is not, this does not mean that when an office is set up under a certain office that it may not or it's not independent in terms of functions. It can still be independent, but in the face of it, when you see an office is under a certain office, the feeling or the assumption you have is that the upper office has power over the under office. So um,
Yeah,
being under
that
a
happens.
certain office or
Apparently,
ministry, being under a certain ministry or a certain office doesn't really negate the independence of that organization or commission. There are so many things that you have to look into to determine whether this office is really independent in the context of data protection functioning and discharging their functions. And that includes the appointing authority, as I spoke before when I was giving an example for PAP, appointing authority, dismissing authority, remuneration and benefits, who determine those things. Those are the things that even if an
yeah.
office is self-standing and those aspects are controlled by a single person, that office may not be as independent as an office that is under a certain ministry or commission whose staff and chairperson is appointed by the parliament, for example. So independence of data protection commissions is not just the structuring of the office. There are so many more aspects that one has to consider to be able to say that this office is independent.
That's a very fair point to make, Patricia. That's a very fair, very, very fair point to make. So independence also has to do with looking at it on a granular level. Okay, Dr. Patricia, you were just mentioning something about you know, some missing aspects of data protection laws in your country that you wanted to spotlight as well. Can you just let us into that a little bit?
Yes. Speaking about my country and the pitfalls of the Data Protection Act is a bit difficult because, mother country and everything. But it is also sad that some of the things in the law are not very how do I say up to date. One of the things that really concerns me is the provisions that allows a person, a data subject, to the right to delete information when it's no longer relevant, or they just want to delete it. They don't want it to be processed anymore. And so this provision grant the data subject the right to delete, but at the same time has a condition to a data controller. Actually, the law doesn't have a data controller. There's only data collector. So it gives a condition to a data collector who is seen in this law as a data controller to not delete the original copies of data that is to be deleted. So when I look at this section, I was a bit confused because I believe the right to be forgotten means to delete every copy of information that is requested to be deleted, that a person wants to be forgotten in that aspect. And so when the law gives a condition to data collector that they should not delete the original copy of the information that is deleted, how do a person get this right to be forgotten? So that is one of the things that I
Yeah,
I
feel
mean, it
is
defeats the
very
purpose.
critical in this law. Yeah,
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 you never be forgotten at this point. Yeah, yeah. That's quite a dangerous one, to be honest. It kind of
Yeah,
cancels
it
out
just
the whole
defeats
point
the
of
whole
the.
purpose.
yeah.
Thank you very much. That's actually a really good one. I feel like we've gotten a lot, even more than we thought we would get, which is a sign of a good episode when you have more than you think you would get. Just so that I can stop keeping it on the wraps, for those listening, on today's episode, we'll be discussing states and surveillance. Particularly, we're talking about democracy, elections, third country interference, and the role of data protection in basically shaping or protecting our democratic rights, basically, as is the subject. So, this is going to be a very interesting conversation. I feel like I'm so excited to have the conversation. I'm excited about the beginning of the conversation. Anyway, so let's start. Very on a very light note. Okay, so we know there's this thing called state surveillance. Then there's this thing called data protection. And then there's this thing called politics. Uh, and then there's this thing called democracy. And then there's this thing called elections.
Yeah, today I like
Um,
how you're being
so
very
what
careful at mentioning each concept.
world do these things sort of fit together? And when we then say state surveillance within the context that we have identified, all these key ideologies that we have mentioned, what do we mean by state surveillance in those settings?
Well, I guess as Ares said, Yetunde, you're very clever. You're trying to avoid the risks of being direct, and you just throw the ball on me so that I can I'll try to go around like you did. So I believe you want to speak about surveillance and data protection in terms of political processes and surveillance that is done in a way that influences voters or influences elections. Well, to begin with, I think the best example would be the 2016 US election, which, as we all know, it was tainted with, I don't know what to call it. It was whether allegations that there's an Asian country that was surveilling and launched cyber attacks to election infrastructure to be able to undermine democracy. And so the idea, actually, what happened is not just surveillance. There are two things here involved. There is surveillance, that is the first aspect, and there is cyber attacks. So surveillance, what it does is to look into behaviors. It's like targeted advertisement. You look into behaviors of people on their online activities, because, as you know, most of our political discussions are now taking place on the digital sphere. So you surveil those conversations and discussions, and through that, and using technology, you may be able to determine or to sort of guess where the election is going, or who has a lot of people on their side. And so, if you want to reverse those, you know, the processes, what you do is you introduce misinformation to influence voters to, vote for someone you think you want to win. So what was done, or what is said to have been done during the 2016 election, is that the Asian country had employed surveillance and the use of technology to influence voters and to drive political agenda in the US. And what they did is they used, for example, misinformation. One of the things, one of the information that was spread is that one of the Republican candidate was had dropped out of the race, which was not true. That means voters will think that, okay, this was supposed to be my candidate. So if he's no longer running, then, well, I can vote for someone else. So that will affect, or will the votes in somehow. Another thing that they use is the use of deep fake videos, and they will use those showing that a candidate is maybe campaigning but saying things that obviously the voters wouldn't want to hear. And through those deep fake videos, they also spread misinformation, which at the end of it, they drove political agenda, and they sort of influence the voting process. Another thing they also do, which is, okay, at the moment we only think that this is useful for consumers selling their items or services, but the use of targeted ads, for example, even at the moment, at the 2020 elections, because of COVID, a lot of people couldn't go to vote, or to where they could vote physically. So they use
Yeah.
mobile apps, voting apps. And so through these voting apps, they could, using the targeted advertising technique, they could, ascertain preferences of people or voters, and be able to sort of use these and send them ideas. When you, for example, you're searching for some goods or some items online, and then afterwards you receive some, suggestion of similar item. They did the same thing, like they know you are about to vote, and maybe you want to vote for a candidate A, but their intention is to, influence you to vote for candidate B. What they do is, using the same technique they use for advertising consumer goods and services, they use it to send you, ads or to send you videos or things that will somehow, it's like a mind trick, will influence you into moving from candidate A to candidate B. So there's a lot of things that had happened in terms of surveillance, but also in terms of cyber attacks. So this cyber attacks is another side of what had happened in 2016 in the US elections. It is assumed, or it is alleged, that this country, the Asian country, this is very hard to speak about because, you don't have to mention things because at the end of the day, you don't want to find yourself in trouble. So,
Yeah.
it used cyber attacks to be able to penetrate election infrastructure. And by doing so, was able to access or to view data of voters that were in these databases. And by using or by viewing this data, the hackers could be in a position either to change information of voters, and this will also affect sort of election very huge magnitude, because if I'm registered as Patricia Boshe, I have to vote for, let's say I'm in Kentucky, I have to vote there. And then you change my information, like I'm Patricia Boshe, but I'm supposed to vote in Los Angeles. So that means this is it's a huge thing in terms of election, because one vote is.
Said quite a lot, right? And I mean, I'm just taking right. But one thing that comes to mind is there's definitely a problem with regards to these data-driven elections, right? And I think the question I'd really like to ask you is, in this situation where, or in these situations where voters are now being treated like consumers, right? What data protection challenges do you think that this poses to citizens?
Well, data protection and privacy challenges are the same as the ones that are being posed by the use of technology in any other context. But the problem with this, for example, if I take an example of African region, African countries, is that, for example, in many countries, a voter's information includes very sensitive data. You don't have only names and age and the province that you're supposed to be voting. You have, in some countries, you have iris scans, you have fingerprints, you have things that if the hacker is successfully get
Yeah, biometric data.
information from the voters, yeah, from election infrastructure, can use such information beyond election disruption. If I have your iris scan data, I have your fingerprints, I can do so many things that can touch into your financial aspects, can touch your personal aspect, employment aspect. I can actually do anything that requires such sensitive information. So that's the downside of it.
I just wanted to sort of get into something that you said earlier. So you kind of set up the stage for us for this conversation by really taking us through all the different avenues through which we can get that sort of third party or third state interference in elections. It sort of screams to me like it's almost like, is democracy still alive, and the right to vote, how much of it is it still sacred? Because if my mind can automatically or can be changed to predispose me to vote a certain way that I don't genuinely want to vote, at what point um do my choices really matter? Kind of feels like strings are being pulled behind me and I'm just acting going accordingly, like there's a script that we're all just running. But I think more for the sake of this conversation and not the very dystopian element that this sort of brings to mind, I'm wondering where does the personal data come in? So let's think in terms of, you've mentioned the data that could be had or could be kept, but where is the processing? Because then we're having a data protection conversation, and we want to know, when we think about data protection, think about the key elements being personal data existing, the concept of the processing that then needs to be processed in accordance with what data protection expects data to be processed at. So where does the personal data come in, and what is the processing that goes on that ought not to be going on, or that ought to be going on in a different way to the way that it is currently being done?
Oh, well, when you speak in context of elections and democratic processes, when, for example, in the case of the U.S. Election into 2016, is that personal data was used for purposes that were not intended, or maybe the voters did not intend for such information to be used in such manner. For example, when they use information to influence, they didn't expect, or they didn't provide their information so that they can be influenced, politically influenced. So that is beyond the purpose that for the data they offered, or the data they submitted for purposes of voting, for purposes of political processes. You
So we
also
have a breach
asked,
of purpose rule, sort of, just to kind
yeah.
of make, yeah, okay.
Mhm. And so another thing you mentioned is if democracy is still there, and the fact that being influenced to do something that you originally didn't intend to do, but manipulated using technology and misuse of data, I would say yes, it is still there. The fact that you were sort of manipulated doesn't mean that democracy is not there. There are things that can be done, for example, to maintain or restore, so to speak, uh, democratic values as we know them. For example, let's use misinformation or disinformation. There could be some things that can be done to counterattack that. For example, I'll give you an example of a platform. I'll go back to Tanzania, a platform in Tanzania, Jamii Forum, it's called. This platform allows people to share to have their civic participation online. They can share anything and everything about anything and about anybody. But there is something they call it Jamii Check. That means you provide information however you want it to be, and the people behind this platform are working as minions to cross-check and confirm those information. So what you see is that when information is posted, it could have a red tag. If there's a red tag, they did not remove that information. They leave it on platform, but they red tagged it. That means that information is false. If the information is green tagged, that information had been verified and is true. If it's yellow, that means that information is 50-50. There are so many techniques that can be used to counterattack the misinformation and things that can influence people at some extent, to be able to, maintain or restore the integrity of information and integrity of, let's say, election.
Well, this is quite interesting actually, because we then wonder why we don't see some of these tactics already being taken up by a lot of the bigger social media or forum like social media platforms, red flagging, so such that, and even that's for stuff that is actually being posted by data subjects themselves. But then we then even move to the area of advertising, which was one of the key elements that you introduced earlier as
Mhm.
one of the tools used to influence voters and their participation in elections. We then wonder why those sort of tactics are not also being employed towards the sort of nature of advertisement that goes out, and which was something that I think we can all sort of say, oh, what we one of the things that was highlighted in the run up to the 2016 elections for the US as well, or in the
Mhm.
course of the 2016 elections. So, what are your feelings about that, and what do you think is possibly the explanation? Is it that there aren't enough minions to cover for the larger social media platform, or is it just that it's a little budgeting issue?
Well, I hate to be the devil's advocate, but I don't think that there isn't enough minions to be able to verify and cross check information. is that I believe, and this is my personal opinion, I believe that those owning social media platforms are not either not motivated or are not do not really care. You remember during
Mm.
the 2016 election, there, for example, Twitter and Facebook tried to pull down anything that was considered misinformation, false information, damaging information. If they could do that during that time, why can't they have
Period.
something that
Yeah.
is sustainable? It's always there to cross check information and make sure that information that is available in their platform is at least correct to some extent. Use the same method, for example, like Germany Forum. I mean,
Yeah.
if you are able to do it, why not do it in a sustainable manner? Because misinformation doesn't only come during election. It is something that is built slowly.
Yeah.
I mean, it is something that is doable.
So it's really a matter of choice here.
Yeah.
Also wanted to add as well, in the course of this conversation, we've consistently referred to the 2016 US elections. Now, I'm just curious to say, is this only a US problem? Is it only a Western problem? Is it only a small scale problem? Is it a large scale problem? Should we be worried about it? Where does the box stop basically? How big is the problem of election meddling, and should we all be worried about it on the edge of our seats?
So now I'll be talking about speculations. So this is not
Hmm.
just the US problem. There are speculation that the Asian countries are in a campaign to undermine Western democracy and NATO members' democracy. And this has
Hmm.
not just happened in the US. It happened in the very huge magnitude, and it's about 21 states that received a cyber attack attempt. But in
Yeah.
2017, I think in France, in Germany, something similar happened. So it's not just something for the US, it's something that is, according to speculation, attacked, is an attack to the Western democracy. So it is something, as you say, if or not is something to be worrying about. I would say yes, whether or not we are in the Western world, because surveillance and cyber attacks are not something for, designated for the Western countries or Asian countries. It is something that can also, and there are activities that are happening in the African continent. So this is a global problem, so to speak.
I mean, I totally agree. And I think particularly more concerned, about Africa, right? Because of I mean, we keep seeing an increase in the way technology is being used to carry out elections, and I mean, this is a good thing, right? But are we paying enough attention to the concerns and the issues that may arise from that, right? So I think really bringing it to Africa, right, in terms of the data protection laws we have in place, how and I mean, I need you to maybe cast your mind to what you when you mentioned earlier about micro targeting, right? Do you think the laws we have currently are enough to or are adequate in terms of being able to protect the citizens? And I know about two countries, I think Kenya and Senegal sort of released like guidelines on data and elections, right? I mean, what are your thoughts towards these?
Well, laws are one thing, and their effectiveness and actual implementation is another thing. And also at the same time,
True.
it is important to look at the problem and see whether this problem can be addressed by a certain law or regulation. For example, going back to the election problem and surveillance and hacking, we have two distinct problems that calls for two distinct solutions. We have cyber attacks that is related to very sophisticated use of knowledge to hack technological infrastructure. And then we have misinformation, that is the use of distorting information to be able to yield certain objectives. So in this case, for example, when we talk about cyber attacks and data protection law, maybe we can bring in cybersecurity laws or cybercrime laws. It is a matter of, is this law implementable? Is it practical in terms of the circumstances that had happened, for example, in the US? And when you talk of, for example, cyber attacks and hacking, there are so many things to consider. The use of technology. What kind of technology are we using? Is this technology vulnerable to hackers? Is it a new technology or an old technology? I was listening in one of the Congress hearing about the 2016 election, and one of the things that kept coming up is that most of the attacks which were launched is because the technology that was being used at that time was old, and that makes these cyber attacks much easier. And so at some point, I could hear witnesses saying that it was even attacked by people who were almost amateurs. So it didn't need strong skills to be able to hack these computers or election infrastructures, because the infrastructures they had were old. But another thing is that in terms of cyber attacks in Africa in specific is that we receive technology from the Western and Asian world. And I remember there was something about computers that were donated to the African Union back then. And then there was some allegations that there were some surveillance being conducted by the country that donated those computers. And that
Oh wow.
every day in the midnight, the offices of the AU offices in Addis Ababa would automatically be switched on. So I don't know about the truth about that
Midnight.
allegation, but
Okay.
I'm yeah, I'm trying. The point I'm trying to drive here is that if you are a receiver of technology, that also puts you in a very vulnerable position. That how far
True.
can you trust the person who donates those infrastructure or technology in terms of both software and hardware? So there are so many things, so many dynamics. I'm not a computer scientist. I cannot speak of the language of how they hack and how software contributes to hacking and things like that. But what I know is that a person who owns or a person who donates a software or hardware is in a position to be able to put something to access that technology. Another thing is when
I
you talk of
totally
data
agree.
protection laws, and when you talk about, for example, the other aspect, misinformation. How do you control misinformation using data protection laws? I mean, these are things that we have to see and determine how can we regulate misinformation using data protection law. Does data protection law, for example, says that if you publish false information or misleading information, you'll be, liable? If no, then you cannot use data protection to protect to against misinformation. Again, I'm going back to technical solutions like the one I mentioned. You can have people working, if it's a platform, to try, because you cannot say I've succeeded 100% to, deal with misinformation or to submerge misinformation, but we can do the best we can with the resources we have to be able to bring out misinformation, for example, by tagging like this is true, this is false, this is made up, and things like that. As an example I gave you of Jamie for a platform.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually really, those are like really practical things that we can actually be done. But I think very shocking what you said was the fact that even things that are sort of donations need to be looked at with suspicion as well, because a technology has a way of being, there's a possibility of remote access being granted to these,
Mm-hmm.
some of these technologies that are so freely given,
And I mean,
that we ought to sort of
yeah,
about.
Yetunde, just to quickly add to what she said, right? I was sort of doing like a short piece or on data on elections, right? And I did discover there are a lot of like the technology being developed for African elections are not even developed by like Africans themselves. I mean, and this is not such a bad thing, right? But when you think of it in the light of like receiving technology, I mean, it could be a bit worrisome, right?
Oh yeah, it is. For example, I don't want to mention the company, but there has been some speculation that in Uganda, there's a phone company that had an agreement with some African countries, including, for example, Uganda and Nigeria, that supply phones. But there's speculation that these phones have how do you call it, tracking mechanisms. And so if you receive donation for technology for a very sensitive activity such as elections, you have to be in a position to be able to, and I don't know if that is technically possible, to see or to sort of scan and see whether there's a possibility of tracking or surveillance technology within it.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's not easy. It's not an easy question to answer in terms of technology technology that is transferred from one country to the other, and whether such technology can be proved, whether or not it can be used for surveillance. It's not an easy question to answer.
Because I think this is, we kind of have to remember also that if, in fact, thinking about data protection generally, data protection sort of invites us to take a look at whenever there's the new introduction of new systems. There's a thorough assessment of those systems to make sure that they're not at risk of compromising
True.
um, the the protection of the data subjects whose data has been processed through those devices. I guess there is, in a sense, that room for the role of data protection to sort of, if taken seriously, to sort of mitigate some of these issues that we have identified,
Uh-huh.
that you have identified, Patricia.
Yeah, I also
Exactly.
think that we shouldn't overburden data protection laws, because there are things that are beyond data protection. For example, regulating cyber attacks, it's
Absolutely, that was
beyond data protection.
yeah,
Or misinformation is also
absolutely.
somehow beyond data protection. There's need to follow,
So,
I think the African Union came up with the data framework policy, which proposes for a very, I don't know if it's feasible, but a very nice approach to regulating data and digital economy, that not only data protection commissioner, but they want to have an interplay of different laws that have are touching into the use of data. But at the same time, the policy proposes a coordination and cooperation between different agencies that deals with data in the data economy, because you cannot deal with data issues in isolation. In this case, for example, you cannot say, okay, I'm a data protection commissioner, I'm coming in because personal information voter in the voters or in election infrastructure has been compromised. What about, you come there, you will deal with the data breach, but there are other aspects that you
Yeah.
cannot address, for example, cyber attacks. Then you need a cyber crime act law or regulator. And then you have information distortion or misinformation. That is another law. There are so many things that are dealing with data that cannot be addressed with just a single law like data protection law. And that's why I think I really applaud the African Union, their proposal for um, you know a major of these commissions. They propose of data protection, I think copyright, I think consumer protection, in intellectual right. I think I don't remember them quite well, but those are agencies that deals with the use of data.
Just a kind of, as we're kind of moving gradually towards like a good point in the conversation before we start getting into some other things, which I would very much like to talk about, but I don't want to take too much of your time. If you would release us, or if you don't have any other questions, I think me too, I'm out of my questions. Dr. Patricia has been so kind and so elaborate in her answers that even questions that I didn't think to ask, and the ones that I would have eventually thought to ask, she actually answered
I
them
do agree.
preemptively. So, yes, thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Patricia. It's been such a fantastic time having you on the podcast, and we really, really,
I
really
mean,
would love
our
to do this again.
expectations were beyond met.
Let's sit down as well, and the wait was absolutely worth it. Thank you so much.
Until next time. It remains our lovely DPO and I, Yetunde. This episode was sponsored by Ikigai Innovation Initiative and was brought to you by Tech Hive Advisory.
And a big shout out to our executive producer, Ridwan Oluyede, associate producers, Dolly and Yetunde.
This podcast was edited by Ayonfe Aino, shout out to her, and our podcast associate, Victoria Adaramola, and graphics by Okwe Abujade.